What would you do if the person who promised to love you forever suddenly called you useless after 60 years of marriage? Most would crumble under the weight of such cruel words, especially coming from someone who had shared your bed, your meals, and your deepest secrets for over half a century. But not Eleanor Thompson. When her husband Frank dismissed her as useless after 6 decades together, she didn't just walk away. She reinvented herself. This is the story of how a 78-year-old grandmother became one of America's most celebrated new authors, proving that it's never too late to find your voice, even when the person who should cherish it the most tries to silence it. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The morning that changed Eleanor Thompson's life forever began like any other Tuesday in April. Sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows of the modest 2-story colonial in Maplewood, Connecticut, that she and Frank had called home for the past 43 years. Eleanor, with her silver hair neatly pinned back, stood at the stove, carefully flipping the blueberry pancakes that had been Frank's favorite breakfast since their honeymoon in 1961. "Frank, breakfast is ready," she called up the stairs, her voice still strong despite her 78 years. No response came from upstairs, which wasn't unusual these days. Frank had grown more taciturn since his retirement from the insurance company 5 years ago. Eleanor set the table anyway. 2 placemats, 2 sets of silverware, 2 napkins folded into triangles, just as she had done every morning for 60 years. When Frank finally appeared in the kitchen doorway, his thinning white hair uncombed and his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose, Eleanor smiled out of habit. "Good morning, dear. I made your favorite." Frank barely glanced at the perfectly arranged table before sitting down heavily in his chair. "Pancakes again? Don't you know anything else?" Eleanor's smile faltered but didn't disappear completely. She'd grown accustomed to Frank's morning grumpiness, especially since his doctor had put him on blood pressure medication that seemed to sour his mood. She set his coffee down, black with 1 sugar, just how he liked it, and took her seat, across from him. "I thought we might drive over to see Sarah and the grandkids today," Eleanor suggested, referring to their daughter who lived just 30 minutes away with her husband and 3 children. "Lily has her dance recital this weekend, and I promised we'd help her practice." Frank stabbed at his pancakes. "I'm not going anywhere today. The Johnsons invited me to their golf game." "Oh," Eleanor said, trying to hide her disappointment. "Well, maybe I could drop you off at the country club and then go see Sarah myself. And how would I get home? You know I don't like depending on others for rides." Eleanor sipped her tea. "I could come back and pick you up when you're finished," Frank snorted. "And waste all that gas driving back and forth? Gas isn't cheap, Eleanor, and it's not like we're swimming in money from your contributions." The comment stung, but Eleanor had heard variations of it before. Despite having worked as a librarian for 23 years before retiring, Frank had always minimized her financial contributions to their household, emphasizing that his career in insurance had been their primary income source. "I thought I might start in the garden today, too," Eleanor continued, determined to keep the conversation pleasant. "The daffodils are coming up, and I want to plant those tomato seedlings I've been growing on the windowsill." Frank looked up from his plate for the first time, his expression one of exasperation. "What's the point? You planted tomatoes last year, and half of them rotted before we could eat them." "The timing was off last year. I've been reading about better techniques." "Reading," Frank interrupted with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Always with the reading. What good has all that?" "Reading ever done for you, Eleanor? Or for anyone else?" Eleanor set down her fork, her appetite suddenly gone. In their 60 years together, Frank had often made disparaging remarks about her love of books, but there was something in his tone today that felt different, sharper, more deliberate. "Reading has brought me a lot of joy, Frank," she said quietly. "And I shared that joy with hundreds of children during my years at the library." Frank drained his coffee cup and pushed his half-eaten breakfast away. "Joy doesn't pay the bills? Joy doesn't fix a leaking roof or replace a broken water heater. I spent my life doing real work, making real contributions, while you played with books and now putter around with flowers that die every year anyway. Eleanor stared at her husband, a man whose smile had once made her knees weak, whose hands had held hers through the births of their 2 children, through the death of their son Michael in a car accident 20 years ago, through countless Christmases, and anniversaries and ordinary Tuesdays like this one. When had his eyes grown so cold when they looked at her? "I think I'll go to Sarah's by myself today," Eleanor said, rising to clear the dishes. "Fine," Frank said, already reaching for the morning newspaper. "It's not like you're useful around here anyway." Eleanor froze, her hands full of dishes, her back to Frank so he couldn't see how his words had landed like a physical blow. "What did you say?" Frank rustled the newspaper, not bothering to look up. "You heard me. You're not useful, Eleanor. You haven't been for years. You cook meals no one wants. You plant gardens that fail. You read books that gather dust. What's the point of any of it?" 60 years of marriage had taught Eleanor many things. She had learned to swallow her pride, to pick her battles, to find joy in small moments, to forgive minor transgressions. But standing in her sunny kitchen on an ordinary Tuesday in April, Eleanor discovered there was a limit to what her heart could bear. Without another word, she set the dishes in the sink, untied her apron, and walked out of the kitchen. She climbed the stairs to their bedroom, pulled her small suitcase from the back of the closet, and began to pack. Frank found her there 20 minutes later, methodically folding her clothes and placing them in the suitcase with the careful precision she brought to all her tasks. "What do you think you're doing?" he demanded from the doorway. Eleanor continued packing, her movements steady and deliberate. "I'm going to stay with Sarah for a while." "Don't be ridiculous. Who's going to take care of things here?" Eleanor finally looked up at him, and for the first time in their marriage, she felt no need to soften her gaze or her words. "I'm not useful anyway, remember? So it shouldn't make any difference if I'm here or not." Frank's face reddened. "You're overreacting. It was just a comment." "It was the truth as you see it," Eleanor replied, zipping her suitcase closed. "And after 60 years together, I think I deserve more than being seen as useless by my own husband." "Where exactly do you think you're going to go?" Frank scoffed. "You're 78 years old, Eleanor. You've never lived on your own. You've never even paid a bill by yourself." Eleanor picked up her suitcase. "I managed the household accounts for 60 years, Frank. I think I can figure out how to pay a bill." As she walked past him in the doorway, Frank reached for her arm. "This is absurd. You're acting like a child." Eleanor gently but firmly removed his hand. "No, Frank. For the first time in a very long time, I'm acting like myself." She drove to Sarah's house in silence, her mind racing with thoughts and memories. When had Frank's occasional criticisms turned into such fundamental disrespect? Had it happened gradually, over decades? Or had it always been there, hidden beneath the surface of their marriage? The questions tumbled through her mind as familiar streets gave way to the highway, then to the quiet suburban neighborhood where Sarah lived. Sarah opened the door before Eleanor could even ring the bell, as if some maternal intuition had alerted her to her mother's arrival. "Mom? What's going on? Is Dad okay?" Eleanor managed a small smile. "Your father is fine. I'm the one who's not okay. Could I stay with you for a while, honey?" Sarah's expression shifted from concern to shock as she ushered her mother inside. "Of course you can stay, but what happened? You and Dad have never spent a night apart except when one of you was in the hospital." Eleanor set her suitcase down in the entryway. "Your father told me I'm useless." Sarah's eyes widened. "He what? Dad said that?" "After 60 years of marriage, it turns out that's how he sees me." Eleanor's voice wavered slightly, but she steadied it with a deep breath. "I need some time away to figure out what comes next." "Mom." "I'm so sorry," Sarah said, pulling her mother into a hug. "Dad's been getting more difficult lately. but I never thought he'd say something that cruel to you." Eleanor returned the hug, drawing strength from her daughter's embrace. "Neither did I, but perhaps I should have. The signs have been there for a while now." Over cups of tea at Sarah's kitchen table, Eleanor recounted the morning's events, surprised at how detached she felt from the story, as if she were describing something that had happened to someone else. Sarah listened intently, her expression shifting between anger, disbelief, and concern. "You know you can stay here as long as you need to," Sarah assured her when Eleanor finished speaking. "The guest room is all yours." "Thank you, honey. I won't impose for too long. I just need some time to think." A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. Take all the time you need, and don't worry about imposing. The kids will be thrilled to have their grandmother around more. As if on cue, the front door burst open, and Sarah's youngest daughter, Lily, raced into the kitchen, her backpack bouncing against her back as she ran. "Grandma!" she exclaimed, throwing her arms around Eleanor. "Are you here for my dance recital?" "Practice." Eleanor hugged her granddaughter tightly, breathing in the scent of school and playground and the strawberry shampoo that Lily insisted on using. "Yes, sweetheart, I'm here for your practice and for a little visit." "How long are you staying?" Lily asked, her face bright with excitement. Eleanor exchanged a glance with Sarah. "A little while. Is that okay with you?" "It's the best," Lily declared, already pulling Eleanor toward the living room. "I can show you my dance right now, for—" The next hour, Eleanor sat on Sarah's comfortable sofa, watching as Lily twirled and leaped and occasionally stumbled through her dance routine. The simple joy of her granddaughter's performance pushed the morning's painful confrontation to the back of Eleanor's mind, if only temporarily. When the impromptu recital ended, Eleanor applauded enthusiastically. "That was wonderful, Lily! You're going to be the star of the show." Lily beamed under her grandmother's praise. "Will you help me practice every day until Saturday?" "I would love nothing more," Eleanor promised. That evening, after the children were in bed, Sarah brought a glass of wine to Eleanor, who was sitting in the guest room staring at her unpacked suitcase. "You haven't unpacked," Sarah observed, handing her mother the wine. Eleanor accepted the glass with a small smile. "I suppose I keep expecting your father to call and apologize, and then I'll go home, and everything will go back to normal." Sarah sat on the edge of the bed. "Has Dad called?" "No." "Are you going to call him?" Eleanor took a sip of wine, considering the question. "Not tonight, maybe not tomorrow either. For the first time in 60 years, I think I need to put myself first." Sarah squeezed her mother's hand. "Good for you, Mom." After Sarah left, Eleanor finally unpacked her suitcase, hanging her clothes in the guest room closet, arranging her toiletries in the adjoining bathroom, placing her reading glasses and the book she'd been reading, a mystery novel by a new author she'd discovered, on the nightstand. The unfamiliar routine in an unfamiliar room felt both disorienting and oddly liberating. As she prepared for bed, Eleanor thought about the blank notebook she'd packed on impulse, the one she'd received as a gift from her library colleagues when she retired 15 years ago. She'd always meant to use it for something special, though she'd never quite figured out what that might be. Now, sitting on the edge of the guest bed in her daughter's house, miles away from the life she'd built with Frank, Eleanor had an idea. She retrieved the notebook from her suitcase and opened it to the first clean page. For a moment, she hesitated, pen poised above the paper. Then, in her neat librarian's handwriting, she began to write. "My husband called me useless today, after 60 years of marriage. 60 years of cooking his meals, raising his children, maintaining his home, supporting his career, and loving him through good times and bad. Useless. The word sits in my chest like a stone, heavy and cold and undeniable. But what if he's wrong? What if, at 78 years old, I'm not at the end of my usefulness, but at the beginning of something entirely new. The words flowed easily, surprisingly so. Eleanor wrote until her eyes grew tired, and her hand began to cramp, filling page after page with memories and reflections, questions and possibilities. When she finally set the notebook aside and turned off the light, she felt lighter somehow, as if the act of putting words on paper had helped her shed some of the day's hurt and confusion. The next morning, Eleanor woke before dawn, a habit formed over decades of early risings to prepare Frank's breakfast before he left for work. For a disorienting moment, she reached across the bed for him, forgetting where she was. When her hand met only empty space, the events of the previous day came rushing back, bringing with them a fresh wave of pain, but also, unexpectedly, a sense of possibility. She slipped out of bed, careful not to wake the still-sleeping household, and made her way to the kitchen. There, she found her notebook where she'd left it on the counter the night before. She made herself a cup of tea and sat down to read what she'd written. To her surprise, the words were good, better than good. There was a rhythm to them, a truth that resonated even in the harsh light of morning. Eleanor had always loved reading, had spent her career surrounded by stories, but she had never considered that she might have stories of her own worth telling. She picked up her pen again and continued where she had left off, describing the strange sensation of waking up alone after 60 years of marriage, the mixture of grief and freedom she felt sitting in her daughter's kitchen in the pre-dawn quiet. Eleanor was so absorbed in her writing that she didn't notice Sarah enter the kitchen until her daughter placed a fresh cup of tea beside her. "You're up early," Sarah observed, peering curiously at the notebook. "What are you working on?" Eleanor hesitated, suddenly shy about sharing her words. "Just some thoughts. Nothing important." Sarah smiled knowingly. "It looks important to me. You filled half that notebook already." Eleanor closed the notebook, running her hand over its cover. "I've been thinking about what your father said, about me being useless. And I've been wondering if maybe, at my age, I still have something worthwhile to contribute." "Of course you do, Mom," Sarah said, sitting down across from her. "Dad was being cruel and unfair." "Maybe," Eleanor conceded. "But the thing is, even if he was being unfair, his words made me realize that I've spent my entire adult life defining my worth through my relationship to other people, as Frank's wife, as your and Michael's mother, as a grandmother to your children. I've never really asked myself what I want, what might make me feel fulfilled on my own terms." Sarah reached across the table and squeezed her mother's hand. "It's never too late to start asking those questions, Mom." Later that day, while Sarah was at work and the children were at school, Eleanor sat in the local coffee shop with her notebook, continuing to write. She wrote about her childhood in rural Pennsylvania, about meeting Frank at a church social when she was just 18, about the early years of their marriage when love felt uncomplicated and infinite, about the birth of her children, about the devastating loss of her son, about the gradual erosion of her marriage until it culminated in that painful Tuesday morning. As the afternoon stretched on, Eleanor found herself writing not just about the past, but about the present moment. The unfamiliar freedom of sitting in a coffee shop in the middle of a weekday, accountable to no one, her time entirely her own. And then, almost without realizing it, she began to write about the future, imagining possibilities that had never occurred to her before. By the time she returned to Sarah's house, Eleanor had filled 3/4 of the notebook and had stopped at a bookstore to purchase 2 more, just in case. That evening, as she helped Lily practice her dance routine again, Eleanor felt a new energy coursing through her, an excitement she hadn't experienced in years. When her cell phone rang after dinner and she saw Frank's name on the screen, Eleanor hesitated before answering. Part of her, a larger part than she would have expected, wanted to ignore the call, to continue this strange new journey without his interference. But 60 years of habit won out, and she pressed the answer button. "Hello. Frank," she said, her voice steady. Eleanor, Frank said, his tone a mixture of irritation and uncertainty. When are you coming home? This has gone on long enough. Eleanor closed her eyes, picturing her husband sitting in their living room, probably in his favorite recliner, the TV on in the background, expecting her to capitulate as she always had before. I don't know when I'm coming home, she answered truthfully. I'm not sure that I am. Frank's sharp intake of breath was audible through the phone. Don't be ridiculous. Of course you're coming home. Where else would you go? I don't know yet, Eleanor admitted, but I know I can't go back to being seen as useless by the person who's supposed to love me most in the world. For God's sake, Eleanor, it was one comment made in a moment of frustration. You're blowing this completely out of proportion. No, Frank, I'm not. That comment revealed how you truly see me, and I can't unhear it. I can't unfeel what it did to me. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When Frank spoke again, his voice was different, smaller somehow, less certain. The house feels empty without you. Eleanor felt a pang of empathy for her husband, mixed with a steely resolve that surprised her. I'm sorry to hear that, Frank, but the truth is, I've been feeling empty for a long time, even when I was right there with you. After she ended the call, Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed in Sarah's guest room, her heart pounding. In 60 years of marriage, she had never stood her ground like that with Frank. The conversation had left her shaken, but also strangely exhilarated. She opened her notebook again and began to write about the phone call, capturing the conflicting emotions it had stirred in her. As she wrote, an idea began to take shape. Not just a recording of events, but a story, a narrative that might resonate with others who had found themselves invisible in their own lives. That night, Eleanor dreamed of books, shelves and shelves of them, their spines gleaming in soft light. In the dream, she walked along the shelves, running her fingers over the spines, until she came to one book that seemed to glow more brightly than the others. When she pulled it from the shelf and opened it, she saw her own words on the pages, her own story transformed into something beautiful and meaningful. Eleanor woke from the dream with a clarity she hadn't felt in years. She knew what she wanted to do with the words that had been pouring out of her since that Tuesday morning when Frank had called her useless. She wanted to shape them into a book, a memoir of awakening late in life, a testament to the possibility of reinvention even after decades of self-neglect. Over breakfast, she shared her idea with Sarah, half expecting her daughter to dismiss it as an impossible dream. Instead, Sarah's face lit up. Mom, that's brilliant. You should absolutely write. A book? Do you really think so? Eleanor asked, uncertain despite her dream's clarity. I'm 78 years old. I've never written anything longer than a library newsletter. But you've read thousands of books, Sarah pointed out. You understand the story better than most people. And more importantly, you have something genuine and important to say. Eleanor felt a flutter of excitement in her chest. I wouldn't even know where to begin with publishing. Sarah grinned. Lucky for you, my best friend from college works as an editor at a publishing house. She's always complaining about how hard it is to find authentic voices. I bet she'd at least be willing to look at your manuscript when it's ready. Manuscript, Eleanor repeated, the word feeling foreign and thrilling on her tongue. I guess I better get writing then. Over the next few weeks, Eleanor established a routine that revolved around her writing. Each morning, after helping Sarah get the children off to school, she would walk to the local library or coffee shop, notebook in hand, and write for hours. The words continued to flow, surprising her with their honesty and clarity. In her younger years, Eleanor had always been cautious with her opinions, careful not to rock the boat. Now, approaching her 80th birthday, she found herself writing with a boldness that sometimes took her breath away. She wrote about aging in a society that worshipped youth, about the invisibility that often came with being an older woman, and about the painful process of recognizing that the marriage she had devoted her life to had slowly corroded beneath her feet. "You're glowing, Mom," Sarah remarked one evening as they prepared dinner together. "I've never seen you so passionate about something." Eleanor smiled, chopping vegetables with practiced precision. "It feels like I've discovered a room in my house that I never knew existed. A room that's been there all along, just waiting for me to open the door." Sarah set down the pasta she was measuring and looked at her mother thoughtfully. "Have you talked to Dad lately?" The question dimmed Eleanor's smile slightly. "He calls every few days. Always the same conversation. He can't understand why I'm still away, why I can't just come home and pick up where we left off." "And what do you tell him?" Eleanor sighed. "That I'm not ready. That I'm figuring some things out." "Do you think you'll ever go back?" Eleanor paused her chopping, considering the question. "I honestly don't know, honey. Part of me misses him. Or maybe I miss the routine, the familiarity. But every time we talk, he says something that reminds me why I left. Last time, he asked who was watering his plants, as if that were the only thing I was good for." Sarah squeezed her mother's shoulder sympathetically. "For what it's worth, I think this separation has been good for you. You seem more like yourself. The ironic thing is, I'm not sure I knew who myself was until Frank called me useless," Eleanor admitted. "Sometimes it takes being diminished by someone else to realize how much space you should actually be taking up in the world." A month into her stay with Sarah, Eleanor's first notebook was completely filled, and she was halfway through her second. The scattered reflections and memories had begun to coalesce into something more structured, a narrative with a beginning, middle, and the possibility of a new kind of ending. One afternoon, as she sat in her usual corner of the library, deep in concentration, a voice interrupted her flow. "Excuse me, but I can't help noticing you're always writing when I come in. Are you working on a book?" Eleanor looked up to find a woman about her age with short silver hair and bright, curious eyes standing beside her table. "I suppose I am," Eleanor replied, surprised to hear herself say it aloud. "Though I'm not sure if anyone will ever read it besides me." The woman extended her hand. "I'm Vivian Mitchell. I run the senior writing group here at the library on Thursdays. You should join us." Eleanor hesitated. "I don't know. I've never shown my writing to anyone." Vivian smiled warmly. "That's how we all start. But writing, at its heart, is about connection. Connecting with yourself first, and then, if you're brave enough, with others." Something in Vivian's words resonated with Eleanor. After 6 decades of prioritizing connection with Frank, often at the expense of connection with herself, perhaps it was time to be brave in a different way. "I'm Eleanor Thompson," she said, shaking Vivian's hand. "And I think I would like that." The senior writing group consisted of 7 people ranging in age from 65 to 92. They met in a small conference room at the back of the library, sitting around a rectangular table with cups of tea and coffee, sharing their stories with remarkable candor. At her first meeting, Eleanor listened more than she spoke, absorbing the diverse experiences of her fellow writers. There was Howard, a retired high school principal working on a science fiction novel; Marlene, a widow documenting her global travels since her husband's death; Thomas, a former accountant writing poetry about his childhood in rural Maine; and several others, each with their own unique voice and perspective. When it came time for Eleanor to introduce herself and her work, she felt her heart race with anxiety. "I'm writing about starting over at 78, she said simply. "About learning that it's never too late to reclaim yourself." "That's something we can all relate to," Vivian said encouragingly. "Would you be willing to share a page with us?" Eleanor had prepared for this possibility, selecting a passage that felt both personal and universal. With trembling hands, she opened her notebook and began to read. When she finished, there was a moment of silence that made Eleanor wish she could disappear. Then Howard cleared his throat. "That was extraordinary," he said quietly. "You've captured Exactly how it feels to be valued only for what you do for others, not for who you are. Murmurs of agreement echoed around the table, and Eleanor felt a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with embarrassment and everything to do with being truly seen. "You have a remarkable voice, Eleanor," Vivian told her after the meeting. "Raw and honest, but also deeply compassionate. Have you thought about trying to publish your work?" Eleanor laughed softly. "My daughter says her college friend is an editor, but I can't imagine anyone would want to publish the ramblings of an old woman." Vivian's expression grew serious. "Those weren't ramblings. That was true, beautifully expressed. And I think you might be surprised by how many people are hungry for exactly that kind of truth." Encouraged by Vivian and the writing group, Eleanor continued to refine her manuscript. Sarah's friend Jessica, the editor, had agreed to look at it when it was ready, though she had cautioned that the publishing industry was highly competitive and she couldn't make any promises. Eleanor understood the odds were against her, but the prospect of rejection didn't deter her. The act of writing had already given her so much: a renewed sense of purpose, a community of like-minded souls, and most importantly, a deeper understanding of herself. Publication would be a bonus, not the measure of her success. As spring turned to summer, Eleanor's relationship with Frank remained in limbo. Their phone conversations grew less frequent and more strained. Frank vacillated between grudging acceptance of her absence and irritable demands for her return. Eleanor found herself increasingly able to let his moods wash over her without being pulled under by them. "I'm nearly finished with my book," she told him during one of their calls, surprising herself with the news. She hadn't intended to share this part of her new life with him, knowing he would likely dismiss it. "Your what?" Frank's confusion was evident even through the phone. "My book. I've been writing a memoir." There was a pause, then a short, dismissive laugh. "A memoir? About what?" Eleanor took a deep breath. "About us, in part. About our marriage. And about what happened when you called me useless. About finding myself at 78. "You're writing about our private life for strangers to read?" Frank's voice rose with indignation. "That's completely inappropriate, Eleanor. I won't allow it." The old Eleanor might have immediately backpedaled, might have apologized and promised to abandon the project. But the woman who had been writing every day for months, who had shared her words with the writing group and received their validation, who had begun to recognize her own worth independent of her husband's approval, simply said, "It's not about getting your permission, Frank. It's about telling my truth." "Your truth?" Frank scoffed. "And what about my truth? Don't I get a say in how I'm portrayed in this exposé?" "I've changed your name," Eleanor replied calmly. "And I've been fair in my portrayal. I've written about the good years as well as the difficult ones, but this is my story, Frank. I get to tell it my way." The conversation ended shortly after, with Frank hanging up abruptly and Eleanor left holding the phone, a curious mixture of guilt and liberation swirling within her. The next day, Eleanor received an unexpected visit from Jessica, Sarah's editor, friend who had agreed to look at her manuscript when it was finished. "Sarah mentioned you're almost done with your book," Jessica explained, accepting the cup of tea Eleanor offered. "I'm going to be swamped with projects next month, so I thought I'd see if you'd let me take a look at what you have now, even if it's not completely polished." Eleanor hesitated, thinking of her confrontation with Frank. "It's still very rough, and I'm not sure if it's even good enough to be published." Jessica smiled. "Why don't you let me be the judge of that? No pressure. I'll just give you my honest, professional opinion." Against her better judgment, Eleanor retrieved her notebooks and her laptop, where she had been typing up her handwritten drafts. "Here it is, for better or worse," she said, handing over months of her heart and soul captured in words. "Great," Jessica said, tucking the materials into her bag. "I'll read it this weekend and let you know what I think." After Jessica left, Eleanor felt a surge of panic. She had just handed her most vulnerable self to a virtual stranger for evaluation. What if Jessica hated it? What if her writing was amateurish, her story uninteresting to anyone but herself? As Eleanor paced Sarah's guest room trying to calm her anxiety, her phone rang. It was Frank again. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began without preamble. "About telling your truth. And I need to tell you something important." Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed, her heart suddenly pounding. "What is it, Frank?" The 6 months leading up to the publication of Eleanor's memoir, which Meridian Press had titled Useless, Finding Purpose After 60 Years of Marriage, were a whirlwind of activity. There were extensive editing sessions with Jessica, photo shoots for the book jacket, marketing meetings, and early interviews with literary magazines eager to feature the story of a 78-year-old debut author. Throughout it all, Eleanor found herself navigating a new kind of partnership with Frank. His recovery progressed steadily, though more slowly than he would have liked. By Christmas, he was able to manage most daily activities on his own. But the experience of vulnerability had softened something in him, creating space for a humility that had been absent during their decades together. "Read me what you worked on today," he would say in the evenings, settling into his recliner with genuine interest in his eyes. Eleanor would share passages from her latest edits, still marveling at how the man who had once dismissed her reading as a waste of time now listened intently to her words, occasionally offering thoughtful feedback or asking insightful questions. "You make me sound kinder than I was," he commented one night after she read a passage about their early years together. Eleanor looked up from her manuscript. "I remember the kindness more clearly than the rest from those days. You were different then. We both were." Frank nodded, his expression contemplative. "I've been thinking about what changed. When we were young, every moment together felt like a gift. Somewhere along the way, I started taking you for granted, seeing you as an extension of myself rather than as your own person. That happens in many marriages," Eleanor replied, touched by his rare introspection. "But it doesn't have to be permanent." As winter gave way to spring, advance copies of Eleanor's memoir began circulating among book reviewers and influencers. The initial feedback exceeded everyone's expectations. "Your narrative perfectly captures the universal experience of being rendered invisible," wrote one prominent reviewer. "But more importantly, it offers hope that visibility, to oneself and to others, can be reclaimed at any age." Margot from Meridian Press called with increasingly exciting updates. "Bookstore pre-orders are strong," she reported in early March. "And we've had interest from several book clubs, including," she paused dramatically, "the National Book Club Network." Eleanor, who had spent decades helping library patrons find the perfect read, understood the significance immediately. The NBCN selections reliably became bestsellers. "Are you serious?" she gasped, gripping the phone tightly. "Very," Margot confirmed. "They're considering you for their May selection. If they choose the book, we're talking thousands of additional sales. Minimum." That evening, as Eleanor shared the news with Frank over dinner, she noticed tears in his eyes. "What's wrong?" she asked, alarmed by his emotional response. Frank shook his head, wiping at his eyes with embarrassment. "Nothing's wrong. I'm so damn proud of you, Ellie, and ashamed of myself for not seeing who you really were all these years." Eleanor reached across the table to take his hand. "You're seeing me now. That's what matters." 2 weeks before the official publication date, the news became official. Useless had been selected as the National Book Club Network's May pick. The announcement triggered a cascade of media attention that left Eleanor breathless. "They want me on the Morning America show," she told Sarah during their weekly lunch, "and 3 national radio programs. Margot says we need to expand the book tour to 15 cities." Sarah beamed with pride. "Mom, do you realize what's happening? You're going to be famous." Eleanor laughed. the idea still too surreal to fully comprehend. At 78? That seems unlikely. Age is just making your story more compelling, Sarah insisted. You're becoming an inspiration to women everywhere who've been told they're past their prime. The truth of Sarah's words became apparent on publication day, when Eleanor arrived at her first book signing at a prominent Manhattan bookstore to find a line of readers stretching around the block. Women of all ages, though many with silver hair like her own, waited patiently with copies of Useless clutched in their hands, eager to meet the author who had articulated their unspoken frustrations and hopes. Your book gave me the courage to enroll in law school at 55, one woman told Eleanor as she signed her copy. My husband said I was too old, but your story reminded me that it's never too late. Another reader, tears in her eyes, confessed, I've been married for 42 years, and I've felt invisible for at least 30 of them. Your memoir helped me find the words to talk to my husband about how I feel. Story after story, signature after signature, Eleanor absorbed the profound impact her words were having on readers' lives. By the end of the day, her hand was cramped from signing and her heart full to bursting with the connections she had made. Frank waited for her in the hotel lobby when she returned, a bouquet of daisies, her favorite since their courthouse wedding, 60 years ago, in his hands. How was it? He asked, his face alight with curiosity. Eleanor sank into a chair, emotionally and physically exhausted but exhilarated. Overwhelming. Beautiful. I never imagined my words could mean so much to so many people. Frank sat beside her, taking her hand in his. I'm sorry I can't travel with you for the whole tour. The doctor was clear about your limitations, Eleanor reminded him. Besides, Sarah will be with me for the West Coast portion, and Jessica for the Midwest. I'm in good hands. Still, Frank insisted, I want to be there for the big television appearance next week, if you're comfortable with that. Eleanor studied his face, noting the earnestness in his eyes. You realize they'll ask about you? About what you said that day? Frank nodded soberly. I know, and I deserve whatever judgment comes my way. But I want to support you, to show that I believe in what you're doing. The Morning America appearance exceeded all expectations. The host, charmed by Eleanor's authentic warmth and articulate passion, extended her segment from the planned 5 minutes to nearly 15. When Frank joined her on stage for the final portion, the audience's initial coolness, they had, after all, read about his cruelty in Eleanor's memoir, melted under the obvious affection and respect that now flowed between the long-married couple. Would you say your relationship is better now, after everything that happened? The host asked. Eleanor and Frank exchanged a glance, a lifetime of shared history passing between them. It's different, Eleanor answered carefully. There's more honesty, more awareness of each other as individuals rather than as husband and wife. I don't think we could have found this new path without the painful catalyst that started it all. I was wrong, Frank added simply, his deep voice steady despite his nervousness. And I'm grateful every day that Eleanor found the strength to show me exactly how wrong I was, not just by leaving, but by discovering her own remarkable gifts. As spring turned to summer, Useless climbed steadily up the bestseller lists, eventually reaching the coveted #1 spot in mid-June. Eleanor's calendar is filled with speaking engagements, book club appearances, and even invitations to address university graduating classes. At 79, she found herself busier and more fulfilled than she had ever been. Meridian wants to know if you're working on another book, Jessica mentioned during one of their regular check-ins. They're eager to offer you a contract for a second memoir, or perhaps a novel. Eleanor laughed, shaking her head in wonder. A year ago, I hadn't written anything longer than a thank you note. Now they want a second book? The publishing world moves fast when they find a star, Jessica grinned. And make no mistake, Eleanor, you're a star. On a warm evening in late July, Eleanor and Frank sat on their back porch, watching fireflies dance among the tomato plants that were finally thriving under Eleanor's attentive care. 9 months had passed since his surgery, and though he would never regain the robust energy of his younger years, Frank had settled into a new rhythm of life, one that included weekly games of gentle golf with his friends, regular checkups with his cardiologist, and a marriage that bore little resemblance to the one that had existed before Eleanor walked out. "I got another letter today," Eleanor said, sipping her iced tea. "From a woman in Oregon. Her husband called her useless after 42 years of marriage. She gave him a copy of my book and told him he had 1 month to read it and really think about their relationship. After he finished it, he enrolled them in marriage counseling." Frank smiled, the creases around his eyes deepening. "Your words are changing lives, Ellie, just like they changed mine." Eleanor reached for his hand, a gesture that had once been automatic but now felt like a conscious choice, an affirmation of the new understanding between them. "We changed each other's lives 60 years ago, too. Maybe we just needed a reminder of how powerful that can be." Frank squeezed her fingers gently. "Have you decided about Meridian's offer for the second book?" Eleanor nodded, her eyes on the garden she had planted, the tangible symbol of her renewal. "I have. I'm going to write a novel this time, about a woman who discovers at 80 that life is just beginning." "Sounds autobiographical," Frank teased. "Maybe slightly," Eleanor admitted with a smile, "but with more adventure than memoir would allow. My protagonist is going to travel the world, have a whirlwind romance, maybe solve a mystery or two. Living vicariously?" Eleanor shook her head, her silver hair gleaming in the golden evening light. "Not vicariously, expansively. Writing has taught me that there are infinite ways to experience life, infinite stories waiting to be told. I may be approaching 80, but I feel like I'm just learning how to really live." Frank was quiet for a moment, his gaze thoughtful. "Do you regret staying with me all these years? Now that you've seen what else life could offer?" It was a question that required honesty, and their new relationship demanded nothing less. "I regret the years I spent diminishing myself to avoid rocking the boat," Eleanor said carefully. "I regret accepting less than I deserved in terms of respect and appreciation. But no, Frank, I don't regret our life together. It brought us Sarah and Michael, the grandchildren, and countless moments of joy among the difficult times. And without those 60 years, without that painful moment when you called me useless, I might never have found my voice." Frank nodded, acceptance settling over his features. "For what it's worth, I'm grateful you found your way back to me, even after I gave you every reason to leave for good." "We're writing a new chapter now," Eleanor told him, her writer's mind automatically framing their experience in literary terms. "One where we both get to be fully ourselves while choosing to be together." Later that night, as Eleanor sat at her desk working on the outline for her novel, her phone pinged with a message from Margot. "Great news. Final numbers are in for the first printing. Useless has officially sold over 1 million copies. You're not just a bestseller, Eleanor. You're a publishing phenomenon." Eleanor stared at the message, remembering the morning nearly a year ago when Frank's cruel words had shattered her world, when she had packed a small suitcase and driven away from the only life she had known for 6 decades. Never in her wildest dreams could she have imagined where that painful journey would lead, to a newfound sense of self, to the discovery of her voice as a writer, to the transformative experience of connecting with readers around the country, to a different kind of marriage based on mutual respect rather than habit and expectation. 1 million copies, she whispered to herself, testing the reality of the words. 1 million people had read her story. 1 million people had connected with her journey from invisibility to vibrant presence. With a sense of quiet wonder, Eleanor opened her laptop and began to type the opening sentence of her new novel. At 79, Lillian Palmer received 3 pieces of news that would change the rest of her life. Her first book had sold its millionth copy, her husband of 60 Years had finally learned to see her, and she had just been diagnosed with terminal cancer. Eleanor's fingers froze above the keyboard. Where did that last part come from? She hadn't been planning a story about illness or mortality. Yet somehow, the sentence felt right. A recognition that even in the midst of extraordinary success and personal happiness, life continued to offer challenges and continued to demand courage and resilience. "Well, Lillian," Eleanor murmured to her nascent protagonist, "it seems we both have quite a journey ahead of us." From down the hall, she heard Frank call her name. "In here," she replied, saving her document before closing the laptop. Frank appeared. In the doorway of her study, the room that had once been their rarely used formal dining room until Eleanor had claimed it as her writing space 6 months ago. "Sarah just called," he said, his expression a mixture of excitement and trepidation. "Apparently, Hollywood is interested in your book. A producer contacted Margot about the film rights." Eleanor blinked, certain she had misheard. "Film rights? They want to make a movie about us?" Frank nodded, a slow smile spreading across his face. "About you, primarily. About how you transformed from a taken-for-granted wife to a literary sensation at 78. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, laughter bubbling up from deep in her chest. "Who do you think they'll cast to play you? Someone handsome, I hope." Frank's eyes twinkled with amusement. "I'm more interested in who'll play you. It needs to be someone extraordinary to capture the remarkable woman you've become." As they stood together in the doorway of her study, surrounded by the physical manifestations of Eleanor's success, framed reviews, stacks of foreign editions of her book, a wall calendar marked with speaking engagements and interview dates, Eleanor marveled at the strange and winding path that had led them here. "When you called me useless that morning," she said softly, "could you ever have imagined this outcome?" Frank shook his head, regret and wonder mingling in his expression. "Never. But then, I never really saw you clearly until you had the courage to walk away." "And now?" "Now," Frank said, taking her hand, "I see a best-selling author, a woman of extraordinary courage and talent, and the person I'm incredibly fortunate to still have in my life despite my own foolishness." Eleanor squeezed his hand, thinking of the millions of words she had written over the past year, and the millions more waiting to be written. "It's never too late to be seen," she said, as much to herself as to Frank. "Never too late to become who you were meant to be all along." The call from Paramount Pictures came on a Tuesday morning in August, almost exactly 1 year after Frank had uttered the word useless and inadvertently changed both their lives forever. "They're offering 6 figures for the film rights," Margot explained, her voice brimming with excitement. "And they have Catherine Winters interested to play you." Eleanor nearly dropped the phone. Catherine Winters was one of Hollywood's most respected actresses, known for portraying strong, complex women well into her 70s. That's incredible," Eleanor stammered, struggling to process the news. "But would she really want to play someone like me? I'm just an ordinary woman who wrote a book." Margot laughed. "Eleanor, there's nothing ordinary about your story. Catherine read your memoir in 2 days and called the studio herself. She said it's the role she's been waiting for, a real woman who finds her voice and her power later in life." After ending the call, Eleanor sat in her study, staring out the window at the garden where her tomatoes were ripening in the summer sun. How had this become her life? From invisible wife to best-selling author to having an Academy Award-winning actress want to portray her on screen. Frank found her there, still lost in thought, when he returned from his weekly cardiology appointment. "Good news," he announced, setting his keys on her desk. "Dr. Brennan says my recovery is exceeding expectations. I might even be able to join you for the Seattle and Portland legs of your book tour next month." When Eleanor didn't respond immediately, Frank studied her face with concern. "What's wrong, Ellie? Bad news from the publisher?" Eleanor shook her head, a dazed smile spreading across her features. "The opposite. Paramount wants to make the movie, and Catherine Winters wants to play me." Frank's eyes widened. "Catherine Winters? Catherine Winters?" Apparently, she read the book and connected with it. Eleanor laughed softly. "Can you imagine? A woman like that finds something compelling in my story." Frank sat on the edge of her desk, his expression serious. "I can absolutely imagine it. Your story is compelling because it's authentic and brave. You've touched people, Eleanor. You've helped them see themselves and their own potential." "They're offering 6 figures," Eleanor added, still dazed by the amount. "More money than we've ever had at once." Frank whistled low. "What will you do with it?" Eleanor hadn't considered this question yet. For 60 years, money had been a constant concern, not that they were ever poor, but there had always been careful budgeting, saving for emergencies, putting aside what they could for retirement. The concept of sudden wealth was entirely foreign. "I don't know," she admitted. "We could travel, I suppose, or invest it for the grandchildren's college funds. Or," Frank suggested tentatively, "you could use it to fund that writer's retreat. For older women you mentioned last month, the one you dreamed about creating someday." Eleanor stared at her husband in surprise. She had indeed shared that dream with him one evening, a place where women in their later years could come to discover their creative voices, to write their stories without the distractions of daily responsibilities. She hadn't expected him to remember, much less encourage it. "You think I should do that?" Frank nodded, his gaze steady and supportive. "I think you've discovered firsthand how transformative it can be to find your voice after decades of silence. Why not create a space where other women can experience that same transformation?" 2 months later, Eleanor stood on the sprawling grounds of what had once been a small country inn in the Berkshires, now the future site of the second chapter writer's retreat. The fall foliage created a spectacular backdrop of reds and golds against the clear blue October sky, as she and Frank walked the property with the architect who would oversee the renovation. "We can convert the main house into communal spaces," the architect, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s named Diane, explained. "A library here, writing rooms with views of the mountains, comfortable gathering spaces for readings and discussions. The existing cabins can be renovated as private accommodations, each with a writing desk positioned to capture the natural light." Eleanor nodded, envisioning the space filled with women like herself, silver-haired, carrying decades of experience, finally finding the time and permission to tell their stories. "How soon could it be operational?" she asked. Diane consulted her tablet. "With winter coming, construction will be limited for a few months. But if we push, we could have the first phase ready by late spring, possibly open for a summer session next year." "Perfect," Eleanor decided, her mind already racing with plans for application processes, scholarship programs for women with limited financial resources, and the literary luminaries she might convince to lead workshops. As they walked back to the car, Frank took her hand, a gesture that had become natural again after months of rebuilding their relationship. "This is going to change lives," he said simply. Eleanor squeezed his fingers in acknowledgement. "That's the hope." The film production moved forward in parallel with the retreat preparations. Eleanor found herself pulled into script consultations, impressed by the screenwriter's determination to capture the nuances of her story. Catherine Winters called personally, asking thoughtful questions about Eleanor's life and experiences. "I want to honor your journey," the actress explained during one of their long phone conversations. "To show not just what happened, but how it felt to reclaim yourself after all those years." By December, Eleanor's life had developed a rhythm she could never have imagined a year earlier. Mondays were reserved for writing her novel, which had evolved into a compelling story about an older woman solving a decades-old mystery while confronting her own past. Tuesdays and Thursdays, she worked with the retreat planning committee. Wednesdays, she met with the film production team. Weekends were sacred time with Frank, whose recovery had progressed remarkably, allowing them to enjoy gentle hikes through winter landscapes and evenings by the fire, reading aloud to each other from books they both loved. "Do you ever miss our old life?" Frank asked one snowy evening as they sat in their living room. The house quiet except for the crackling fire and the occasional ping of Eleanor's phone with messages from her publisher, film producer, or retreat coordinator. Eleanor considered the question seriously, as she did all of Frank's questions these days. Their communication had deepened substantially, built on a foundation of honesty that had been missing for decades. "Sometimes I miss the simplicity," she admitted, "knowing exactly what each day would bring. But then I remember the hollow feeling that came with that predictability, the sense that I was just going through motions, not really living." Frank nodded, his gaze on the fire. "I think I felt that hollowness too, but I didn't recognize it. Or maybe I didn't want to. It was easier to maintain the status quo than to ask difficult questions about whether we were truly happy." "Are you happy now?" Eleanor asked, watching his face carefully. A slow smile spread across Frank's features, crinkling the corners of his eyes. "Happier than I've been in years. Watching you flourish, seeing the impact you're having. It's extraordinary, Ellie. And selfishly, I feel like I'm getting to know you for the first time. The real you, not just my wife." The distinction touched Eleanor deeply. For 60 years, her identity had been primarily relational. Frank's wife, Sarah and Michael's mother, the grandchildren's grandmother. Now, at 79, she was Eleanor Thompson, author, founder, creator, a person defined by her actions and contributions rather than her relationships, though those relationships remained precious to her. In January, Eleanor's novel was completed and submitted to Meridian Press, where it was met with enthusiasm equal to her memoir. "We're looking at a fall release," Jessica told her during their editorial meeting. "The momentum from Useless is still strong, and this new book showcases your range as a writer. Mystery with emotional depth and life wisdom. It's a compelling combination." February brought the first day of filming for the movie adaptation. Despite the winter chill, Eleanor and Frank traveled to the set in Connecticut, where the production team had found a house remarkably similar to their own to serve as the primary location. Meeting Catherine Winters in person was surreal. The actress, elegant and vibrant at 74, embraced Eleanor warmly. "There you are," she said, as if greeting an old friend. "The woman who's kept me up nights, highlighting passages and making notes." Eleanor laughed, still somewhat awestruck. "I should be the one starstruck, not you." Catherine waved this away. "Artists recognizing artists. Age just gives us more material to work with." Watching Catherine film the pivotal scene, the moment when Eleanor decided to leave after being called useless, was an emotionally complex experience. Eleanor stood behind the monitors, Frank's hand firmly in hers, as Catherine delivered the lines that had changed everything. "I'm not useful anyway, remember? So it shouldn't make any difference if I'm here or not." "Strange, isn't it?" Frank whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Seeing our worst moment performed by strangers." Eleanor nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. It was strange, and healing in a way she hadn't anticipated. The scene validated her experience, confirmed the legitimacy of her pain and her response to it. Seeing it through the lens of art somehow transformed it from a purely personal wound into something universal, something that might help others recognize their own worth. By March, the second chapter writer's retreat was nearing completion. Eleanor visited weekly, overseeing the installation of bookshelves in the library, selecting comfortable furniture for the writing rooms, and working with local artists to create an environment that would nurture creativity and reflection. During one such visit, as she stood in what would soon be the main workshop space, her phone rang with a call from Margot. "Eleanor, are you sitting down?" the publisher asked without preamble. "Should I be?" Eleanor replied, perching on a nearby windowsill just in case. The National Literary Society just announced their annual awards. Useless has been nominated for Memoir of the Year. Eleanor's free hand flew to her mouth. The NLS Awards were among the most prestigious in publishing, typically dominated by established literary figures with multiple acclaimed works. "That's impossible," she breathed. "I'm a first-time author. They don't nominate debuts." "They do. When the debut changes the cultural conversation," Margot countered. "Your book has sparked discussions about aging, marriage, self-worth, and late-life reinvention across the country. The nomination committee specifically cited the cultural impact of your work." That evening, as Eleanor shared the news with Frank over dinner, she felt almost embarrassed by the continued tsunami of success and recognition. "It doesn't seem fair," she confessed. "So many writers struggle for years without this kind of acknowledgement. And here I am, stumbling into success at 79. Frank considered this, twirling pasta thoughtfully on his fork. "Perhaps it's precisely because you didn't seek it out that your success has been so profound. There's an authenticity to your voice because you're not writing to achieve fame or acclaim. You're writing because you discovered you have something genuine to say." In April, just over a year after Eleanor had packed her suitcase and left Frank, the second chapter Writers' Retreat welcomed its inaugural group of participants. 20 women ranging in age from 65 to 92, each with stories to tell and wisdom to share. Standing before them in the sun-drenched main hall on opening day, Eleanor felt a sense of purpose and fulfillment that transcended even the thrill of her publishing success. "Welcome to your second chapter," she began, looking around at the eager, nervous, hopeful faces. "Some of you may have been writing in private for years. Others might be putting pen to paper for the first time. It doesn't matter where you're starting from. What matters is that you've decided to give voice to your experiences, your insights, your unique perspective on the world." From the back of the room, Frank watched with undisguised pride. He had insisted on being present for this moment, understanding its significance in Eleanor's journey. After her welcome address, as the women dispersed to settle into their cabins, he approached her with a small package wrapped in silver paper. "What's this?" Eleanor asked, surprised. "Open it," Frank urged gently. Inside was a beautiful fountain pen, its barrel a deep blue with subtle gold flecks that caught the light. "It's made from lapis lazuli," Frank explained. "The stone is associated with wisdom and truth-telling." It seemed fitting for the woman who found the courage to tell her truth and is now helping others find theirs. Eleanor held the pen reverently, touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift. "It's beautiful, Frank. Thank you." "There's an inscription," he said, indicating the pen's cap. Eleanor turned it to catch the light and read the delicate engraving. "To E.T. Words have power. Use yours wisely and well." "It's perfect," she whispered, embracing him tightly. May brought the National Literary Society Awards ceremony in New York City. Eleanor and Frank attended in formal attire, both feeling somewhat out of place among the literary luminaries who filled the ornate ballroom. "I still can't believe I'm here," Eleanor confessed as they found their assigned table near the front. "I keep expecting someone to tap me on the shoulder and tell me there's been a mistake." Frank adjusted his bow tie, looking distinguished despite his lingering frailty from the heart surgery. "No mistake. You belong here, Ellie." When the presenter announced, "And the award for Memoir of the Year goes to Eleanor Thompson for Useless," the room erupted in applause. Frank squeezed her hand tightly as she rose, stunned, to make her way to the podium. Standing before the microphone, Eleanor looked out at the sea of faces, literary giants whose works had shaped generations of readers, editors who had discovered and nurtured countless important voices, critics whose words could make or break careers. And there, in the front row, Frank, the man whose thoughtless cruelty had inadvertently launched her on this improbable journey. "Thank you for this tremendous honor," she began, her voice steadier than she felt. "A year and a half ago, I was a 78-year-old woman who had never considered herself a writer. I was defined primarily by my relationships to others, wife, mother, grandmother. Then, in a single moment, the foundation of my identity, was shaken when my husband of 60 years called me useless. From his seat, Frank nodded slightly, accepting his role in this narrative without defensiveness. That moment could have destroyed me, Eleanor continued. Instead, it became the catalyst for the most profound reinvention of my life. I discovered that within me was a voice that had been waiting decades to be heard. And when I finally gave that voice permission to speak, I found that others were waiting to listen. She paused, gathering her thoughts before continuing. I accept this award as validation not just of my work, but of the principle that it is never too late to become who you were meant to be. Those new chapters can begin at any age, that our stories matter, regardless of when we find the courage to tell them. Looking directly at Frank, she added, "And I accept it with gratitude for the painful truth that set me free, and for the man who, in his own journey of growth, has supported my transformation even when it challenged everything." He thought he knew about our life together. The standing ovation that followed her speech continued long after she returned to her seat, tears of gratitude and disbelief streaming down her face. "You did it, Ellie," Frank whispered, his own eyes moist with emotion. "You showed us all what was possible." In June, as summer unfurled across the Berkshires, the second chapter writers' retreat buzzed with creative energy. Eleanor divided her time between mentoring the participants, working with the film production team as they moved into post-production, and finalizing edits on her novel, scheduled for release in September. One warm evening, as she and Frank strolled the retreat grounds after dinner, Eleanor found herself reflecting on the extraordinary turn her life had taken. "If you could go back," she asked him, "knowing what you know now, would you still say it? Would you still call me useless that morning?" Frank stopped walking, taking both her hands in his. "If I could go back, I would recognize your worth much sooner. I would listen more, appreciate more, support your dreams instead of diminishing them." He sighed heavily. "But if my hurtful words were necessary for you to find this path, to become this version of yourself that is touching so many lives, then perhaps they served a purpose neither of us could have foreseen." Eleanor considered this, watching the sunset paint the mountains in hues of pink and gold. "I think we were both trapped in the life we had built, unable to imagine anything different. Sometimes it takes a rupture, something breaking open, to create space for new growth." Frank nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You know, I've been thinking about writing too." Eleanor raised an eyebrow in surprise. "You have? About what?" "About a man who nearly lost everything that mattered because he couldn't see what was right in front of him," Frank replied with a self-deprecating smile. "About learning to see clearly for the first time in 80 years. "You should," Eleanor encouraged, with genuine excitement in her voice. "We could set you up with one of the cabins here at the retreat. You could join the partners' writing group that meets on Thursdays." Frank chuckled. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves. I'm just playing with the idea for now." As they continued their walk in comfortable silence, Eleanor reflected on how thoroughly their roles had shifted. Frank, once dismissive of her literary interests, was now considering writing himself. She, once defined by her supporting role in his life, had become the central character in her own story, and improbably in stories that were touching thousands of others. "You know what I've been thinking?" she said as they reached the main building, its windows glowing warmly in the gathering dusk. "What's that?" Frank asked, holding the door for her. Eleanor smiled, a lifetime of experience in her eyes. "That, sometimes the worst moments of our lives contain the seeds of the best moments, if we're brave enough to plant them, patient enough to nurture them, and fortunate enough to live long enough to see them bloom." Frank's answering smile held all the wisdom of their shared journey, the pain and the healing, the loss and the discovery, the ending of one chapter and the beginning of another. "Well then," he said, taking her hand as they stepped inside together, "here's to late bloomers." Summer faded into autumn, bringing with it a tapestry of changes. Eleanor's novel, titled The Librarian's Secret, hit bookstores in September to critical acclaim and strong sales, establishing her as more than a one-book wonder. The film adaptation of Useless wrapped production and entered post-production, with early studio screenings generating significant buzz, and the second chapter. Writers' Retreat concluded its inaugural session with a public reading that drew literary agents, publishers, and community members to hear the participants share their work. But the most unexpected development occurred. On a crisp October morning when Frank approached Eleanor in her study, a thick manila folder clutched in his hands. "I have something I'd like you to read," he said, uncharacteristic nervousness evident in his voice. "If you're willing." Eleanor set aside the draft of an essay she was writing for The Atlantic about creativity in later life. "Of course. What is it?" Frank placed the folder on her desk, his fingers lingering on it briefly. "It's my story, or part of it at least. I've been working on it at the retreat while you were in New York for your book tour." Eleanor stared at the folder in surprise. Frank had mentioned an interest in writing, but she had no idea he'd actually begun a project, much less progressed far enough to have something to share. "You've been writing? At the retreat?" Frank nodded, a hint of color rising in his cheeks. "Vivian suggested I join the Thursday afternoon group for partners and spouses. I thought it would just be casual writing exercises, but then something happened. The words started coming, and I couldn't stop them." Eleanor opened the folder, with careful hands, discovering nearly 100 neatly typed pages. The title page read simply, "What I Failed to See, A Husband's Reckoning." "It's a memoir," Frank explained as Eleanor leafed through the pages. "About our marriage, but from my perspective. About how I lost sight of you, of us, over the decades. About the wake-up call of almost losing you, and then facing my own mortality with the heart surgery." Eleanor looked up at him, deeply moved by his vulnerability. "Frank, I don't know what to say. This is unexpected." "You don't have to say anything right now," he assured her. "Just read it when you have time. I value your opinion, not just as my wife, but as a writer whose work I respect." The acknowledgement of her professional identity, separate from her role as his spouse, wasn't lost on Eleanor. It represented a profound shift in how Frank saw her, and perhaps in how he saw himself. Over the next 2 days, Eleanor immersed herself in Frank's manuscript, reading his perspective on their shared history with a mixture of pain, recognition, and respect for his unflinching honesty. Frank wrote about his upbringing in a household where men didn't express emotions, about the pressure he felt as the family breadwinner, about his gradual withdrawal into rigidity and criticism as a way to maintain control in a changing world. He increasingly didn't understand. Most poignantly, he wrote about the morning he had called her useless, the catalyst for everything that followed, with a clarity that suggested countless hours of soul-searching. The word left my mouth before I could stop it, unleashed from some dark, frightened place inside me. In that moment, I couldn't see that my cruelty stemmed from my own feelings of uselessness, my fear that in retirement, without the identity my career had provided, I no longer had value. So I projected that fear onto Eleanor, the person who had always been my safe harbor, my constant. I tried to diminish her to avoid facing my own diminishment. It was the most shameful moment of my life, and paradoxically, the beginning of my redemption. When Eleanor finished reading, she found Frank in the garden, pruning the tomato plants as she had taught him during her absence. The autumn sun cast long shadows across the yard as he worked, his movements careful and deliberate despite the lingering effects of his surgery. "I read your manuscript," Eleanor said simply, joining him between the rows of plants. Frank straightened slowly, anxiety visible in the tightness around his eyes. "And? It's powerful, Frank, honest in a way that can't have been easy for you. You've captured something essential about how marriages can both nurture and constrain us, about how easy it is to lose sight of each other over the decades. Relief washed over his features. Do you think it's worth pursuing? As something to publish, I mean. Eleanor considered the question carefully. Yes, I do. Not just because of the quality of the writing, which is surprisingly strong for a first effort, but because it offers a perspective we don't often hear. The man's side of a long marriage, with all its complexities and failings and possibilities, for growth. Frank removed his gardening gloves, tucking them into his pocket. I've been thinking about pairing it with your memoir somehow. Two perspectives on the same relationship, the same crisis point, the same opportunity for transformation, useless and used up, how we lost and found each other after 60 years. Something like that. The concept intrigued Eleanor, a literary conversation between husband and wife, examining their shared history from distinctly different vantage points. It's an interesting idea. Readers would get a more complete picture of the story. And maybe it would help other couples recognize themselves, Frank added. Not just women who feel invisible, but men who've become so attached to traditional roles and expectations that they've lost touch with themselves and their partners. As they walked back to the house together, Eleanor reflected on how thoroughly they had both been transformed over the past 18 months. She, from a woman who had surrendered her identity to the roles of wife and mother, to an acclaimed author and mentor helping others find their voices. He, from a man rigidly attached to traditional gender roles and expectations, to someone capable of vulnerability, introspection, and genuine support for her independence. I'll introduce you to Jessica, Eleanor decided. She's been asking if I have ideas for my next project after the novel. This might be exactly what she's looking for, something unique in the publishing landscape. The following week brought an unexpected invitation. Eleanor and Frank were asked to deliver the commencement address at Wellesley College's spring graduation ceremony. They want us both? Frank asked, puzzled when Eleanor shared the news. I'm not the one with the best-selling books and literary awards. Eleanor smiled, understanding the college's reasoning, even if Frank didn't yet. They're interested in our story as a couple, in how relationships can evolve even after decades, in how it's never too late for growth and change. It's not just about my success as a writer, it's about what our journey together represents. As autumn deepened into winter, their lives settled into a new rhythm. Eleanor divided her time between writing, overseeing preparations for the next session of the retreat, and occasional speaking engagements. Frank continued working on his manuscript with Jessica's guidance, joined a cardiac rehabilitation group that met 3 times weekly, and surprised Eleanor by enrolling in a cooking class focused on heart-healthy cuisine. I realized how much you've always done for me, he explained when she expressed delight at finding him preparing dinner one evening. 60 years of meals on the table, and I never once thought about the effort behind them. It's time I learned to nourish you for a change. In December, they received the first rough cut of the film adaptation of Useless. Watching it together in their living room was an emotionally complex experience. Seeing their pain, conflict, and eventual renewal portrayed by others, their private struggles transformed into art. Is it strange? Frank asked as the credits rolled. Seeing your life story interpreted by strangers? Eleanor considered the question, still processing her own reactions. It's like looking at a familiar landscape from an unfamiliar angle. I recognize everything, yet it somehow looks different. Frank nodded thoughtfully. Catherine captured you perfectly, though. That quiet determination, the way you observe everything, storing it away to process later. She understood something essential about you. And William did well with your character, too, Eleanor offered, referring to the veteran actor who portrayed Frank. He found your vulnerability beneath the gruffness. Frank grimaced slightly. I come across as quite the villain in the first act. Eleanor took his hand, her touch gentle. You were, in a way. But the film shows your growth, too. Your capacity to change. That's what makes it a compelling story rather than just a cautionary tale. In January, as they celebrated Eleanor's 80th birthday with a small gathering of friends and family, news arrived that Useless had been selected to premiere at the Sundance Film Festival, an honor rarely bestowed on a film adaptation of a memoir. "They want us to attend," Eleanor told Frank after the call with the producers, "to participate in a panel discussion after the screening." Frank looked momentarily apprehensive. "Will people judge me harshly, do you think? After seeing how I treated you?" Eleanor considered his concern. "Some might, initially, but our story isn't just about that moment of cruelty. It's about what came after, the hard work of reconciliation, the courage to change established patterns, the possibility of beginning again even in our later years. People respond to hope, to evidence that transformation is possible." The Sundance Film Festival in late January provided Eleanor and Frank with their first taste of Hollywood excitement. The premiere of Useless received a standing ovation, with particular praise for Catherine Winter's nuanced portrayal of Eleanor. The panel discussion afterward became an unexpectedly profound conversation about relationships, aging, creativity, and redemption. "What was the hardest part of sharing your story so publicly?" the moderator asked Eleanor. She thought carefully before answering. "Exposing not just my pain, but my complicity in it. I had to acknowledge that I had allowed myself to become invisible over the decades, that while Frank's words were the catalyst, I had gradually surrendered my own voice long before that." "And for you, Mr. Thompson," the moderator continued, turning to Frank, "what has been the most challenging aspect of seeing your wife's memoir and now this film reaches such a wide audience?" Frank leaned slightly toward the microphone, his expression grave. "Facing the truth about who I had become, seeing myself through Eleanor's eyes, and later through the eyes of countless readers and now viewers, forced me to confront behaviors and attitudes I had justified or simply never examined. It's humbling and necessary work, even at 81. His candor earned appreciative murmurs from the audience, and Eleanor noticed several people discreetly wiping away tears. In February, Jessica approached them with news that exceeded even their most optimistic expectations. "We've received significant interest in your joint memoir project," she told them during a video call. "Multiple publishers are prepared to make offers, but Meridian Press would like to keep you in the family. They're offering a substantial advance and a major marketing campaign." The figure she named left both Eleanor and Frank momentarily speechless. "That's considerably more than I received for my first 2 books combined," Eleanor finally managed. Jessica smiled broadly. "The success of Useless and The Librarian's Secret has established you as a major literary voice, Eleanor. And the concept of pairing your perspective with Frank's creates something truly unique in the marketplace. Plus, with the film generating additional interest, the timing couldn't be better." After the call ended, Eleanor and Frank sat in her study, absorbing the implications of this latest development. "Did you ever imagine, when we met at that church social 62 years ago, that we'd one day be writing a book together?" Eleanor asked, still somewhat dazed by the turn their lives had taken. Frank laughed softly. "I couldn't have imagined any of this. Back then, I thought our path was clearly defined. Marriage, children, work, retirement, growing old together in predictable patterns. I never considered how much richer life could be when those patterns are broken and reshaped." As winter gave way to spring, the pace of their lives intensified. The film was released nationally to critical acclaim and strong box office returns. Eleanor's novel continued to sell steadily, finding new readers through book club selections and word-of-mouth recommendations. Frank's manuscript evolved under Jessica's guidance, growing deeper and more nuanced with each revision. In April, as they prepared for the second session of the second chapter writers' retreat, they received unexpected visitors, a documentary film crew from PBS interested in profiling Eleanor as part of a series on late life achievement. We're focusing on individuals who have found success and made significant contributions after the age of 70, the producer explained during their initial meeting. Your story embodies the theme perfectly. What began as a relatively straightforward profile piece evolved into something more complex as the filmmakers recognized the compelling nature of Eleanor and Frank's joint journey. With their permission, the scope expanded to include frank discussions about their marriage, its near dissolution and subsequent renewal, and interviews with Sarah, with members of Eleanor's writing group, and with women whose lives had been changed by reading Useless or attending the retreat. This feels different from the Hollywood film, Eleanor remarked to Frank after a particularly intensive day of filming. More exposing somehow. Frank nodded in understanding. In the movie, they're actors playing versions of us. Here, it's just us. No filter, no artistic interpretation. Our actual lives are under scrutiny. Yet there was something cathartic about the process too, about articulating their experiences directly, about witnessing each other's perspectives, in real time rather than through the mediated form of writing. In May, they delivered their joint commencement address at Wellesley College, standing together at the podium before thousands of graduates and their families. They had decided to structure their remarks as a dialogue, alternating between their voices to tell their story and share the wisdom they had gained through their separate yet interconnected journeys. When my husband called me useless after 60 years of marriage, Eleanor began, I thought my life was ending. Instead, I discovered it was just beginning. And when my wife walked out the door that April morning, Frank continued, I thought I was the victim of an overreaction. Instead, I was being offered the greatest gift of my life, the opportunity to see clearly for the first time in decades. Their address touched on themes of resilience, reinvention, and the courage to challenge established patterns even in life's later chapters. The response was overwhelming. A standing ovation that continued long after they had finished speaking, followed by a line of graduates and parents eager to share how their words had resonated. I've been feeling trapped in a relationship where I'm not valued, one young woman confided to Eleanor, tears in her eyes. Hearing your story gives me hope that either things can change, or I can find the strength to make a different choice. My father is exactly where you were, a middle-aged man told Frank. Retired, irritable, pushing away the people who love him. I'm going to give him your book when it comes out. Maybe he'll recognize himself in your words. As they drove home from the ceremony, both emotionally drained yet fulfilled by the experience, Eleanor reflected on how thoroughly their private pain had been transformed into public purpose. We're helping people, she said softly. Not just women my age who feel invisible, but younger women, men struggling with traditional roles, couples trying to find new ways to see each other after decades together. Frank reached across the console to take her hand. That makes it all worthwhile, doesn't it? The exposure, the vulnerability, even revisiting painful memories. If our story helps others write a better ending to theirs. In June, exactly 2 years after Frank had uttered the word that changed everything, they stood together at the entrance to the second chapter writers' retreat, welcoming the new group of participants, 25 women this session, ranging in age from 60 to 94, each carrying stories waiting to be told. Welcome to your second chapter, Eleanor greeted them, her silver hair gleaming in the summer sunlight. Or perhaps your third or fourth. That's the beauty of life. It offers us multiple opportunities to begin again, to reimagine who we are and what contribution we have to make. Frank stood beside her, their shoulders touching lightly, a subtle reminder of their connection, now built on mutual respect and genuine appreciation rather than habit or obligation. Later that evening, after the participants had settled into their cabins and the retreat grounds had grown quiet, Eleanor and Frank sat on the porch of the main building, watching fireflies dance among the trees. 2 years ago today, Frank said, breaking the comfortable silence between them, I woke up in a foul mood and took it out on you. I believed I was trapped in a life that was winding down, with nothing meaningful left to experience or contribute. Eleanor nodded, remembering the hollow feeling of that morning, the pain of his dismissal, the courage it had taken to pack her suitcase and drive away. "And now?" she prompted gently. Frank gestured expansively, indicating the retreat center, the evidence of their shared creative work, the new life they had built from the ashes of the old. "Now I understand that endings are just opportunities for new beginnings, that it's never too late to become a better version of yourself, that the greatest adventures can arrive when you least expect them, even at 81. Eleanor smiled, thinking of the journey that had brought them to this moment, the pain and growth, the separations and reunions, the discoveries about themselves and each other that had transformed not just their relationship, but their individual identities. "You know what I've been thinking about lately?" she asked, watching the first stars appear in the deepening blue of the evening sky. "What's that?" How easy it would have been to miss all of this if I had swallowed my hurt that morning instead of standing up for myself. If you had refused to acknowledge your part in what went wrong between us. If we had both been too afraid to imagine a different kind of life than the one we had always known. Frank was quiet for a moment, absorbing her words. "It's terrifying, isn't it? How close we came to never discovering these versions of ourselves. To never write our books, create this retreat, touching all the lives we've touched." Eleanor reached for his hand, her touch both familiar after 6 decades and newly meaningful after 2 years of profound change. Perhaps that's the message at the heart of our story. That it's never too late to stand up for your worth. Never too late to acknowledge your mistakes and commit to growth. Never too late to discover gifts you never knew you had, or to share them with a world that needs them. Frank squeezed her fingers gently, his weathered hand warm against hers. From useless to essential. Who could have predicted that? As darkness settled over the retreat center and the sounds of nature enveloped them, Eleanor contemplated the extraordinary path her life had taken. From the painful rupture of that April morning to the rich, purposeful existence she now led. She thought of the hundreds of thousands of readers who had found courage and inspiration in her words, of the women at the retreat discovering their own voices after decades of silence, of the letters she received daily from people whose lives had been changed by her story. Most of all, she thought of herself at 78, packing a small suitcase with trembling hands, terrified yet determined to assert her worth after 60 years of gradually diminishing herself to maintain harmony. How could that frightened, hurt woman have known that her act of courage would not only transform her own life, but touch countless others? That the word useless, meant to diminish her, would instead become the title of a memoir, a film, a movement that reminded women everywhere of their inherent value? "What are you thinking about?" Frank asked, noticing her pensive expression in the gathering darkness. Eleanor turned to him, a lifetime of experience in her eyes. The pain and joy, struggle and triumph, endings and beginnings that had shaped their shared journey. "I'm thinking about words," she said softly, "how they can wound or heal, diminish or elevate, destroy or create. How the cruelest word I've ever heard became, improbably, the catalyst for the most fulfilling chapter of my life." Frank nodded, understanding. "And I'm grateful every day that those words led not to an ending, but to a beginning. For you, for me, for us." Above them, the stars emerged in full brilliance, bearing witness to the infinite possibilities that await those brave enough to begin again, regardless of age or circumstance, to those who understand that sometimes the most painful moments contain within them the seeds of the most profound transformation. As summer ripened into its fullest expression, Eleanor and Frank's joint memoir project progressed steadily. They established a routine, writing separately in the mornings, Eleanor in her study, Frank in one of the empty cabins at the retreat, then coming together in the afternoons to share their work, offer feedback, and weave their separate narratives into a cohesive whole. The process was both challenging and healing, requiring each of them to revisit moments of their shared history through the other's eyes. For Eleanor, reading Frank's unfiltered account of his growing dissatisfaction and emotional withdrawal during the later decades of their marriage was painful but illuminating. For Frank, confronting the full impact of his dismissive behavior through Eleanor's detailed recollections was often uncomfortable but necessary for his continued growth. "I never realized how many times I cut you off mid-sentence," Frank admitted one afternoon, after reviewing a chapter where Eleanor had cataloged the subtle ways he had undermined her confidence over the years. Reading it all compiled like this, "It's a pattern I never recognized in myself." Eleanor reached across the table to touch his hand. "I never fully articulated it either, not even to myself. I just gradually spoke less, offered fewer opinions, kept more thoughts to myself." "Why didn't you ever confront me about it?" Frank asked, with genuine curiosity in his voice. Eleanor considered the question carefully. "I think I accepted it as the natural evolution of a long marriage. Women of my generation were taught to accommodate, to keep the peace, to find fulfillment in supporting others rather than asserting our own needs. These conversations, though occasionally difficult, deepened their understanding not just of each other, but of the complex dynamics that shape any long-term relationship. Their writing benefited from this growing insight, acquiring layers of nuance and authenticity that impressed Jessica during her editorial reviews. "This is remarkable work," she told them during a video call in late July. "You're creating something truly unique, not just a dual-perspective memoir, but a blueprint for how couples might navigate their own challenges with greater awareness and compassion." In August, as they approached completion of the manuscript, an unexpected email arrived from Dr. Rebecca Chen, a prominent researcher in gerontology and later life development at Columbia University. "I've been following your story with great interest," Dr. Chen wrote. "Your experience exemplifies what we're learning about the potential for significant personal growth and reinvention in older adulthood. Would you be willing to participate in a research study examining the psychological and neurological aspects of creativity and identity transformation after 70? The request intrigued them both. After a preliminary phone conversation with Dr. Chen, they agreed to participate in what would be a year-long study involving interviews, cognitive assessments, and even brain imaging to track the neurological correlates of their creative work and relationship changes. "They want to scan our brains while we write," Frank explained to Sarah during her weekly visit, equal parts amused and proud. Apparently the creative surge Eleanor experienced at 78, and now my own writing at 81, represents something significant for understanding brain plasticity in older adults. Sarah beamed at her parents, her expression a mixture of pride and lingering amazement at the turns their lives had taken. "From Dad calling Mom useless to both of you becoming subjects in a cutting-edge neuroscience study. I couldn't have imagined this 2.5 years ago." The collaboration with Dr. Chen's research team added yet another dimension to their already multifaceted lives. In September, they traveled to Columbia for their first round of assessments and brain imaging, fascinated by the preliminary findings. "Your neural activity patterns are extraordinary," Dr. Chen told them as they reviewed the colorful brain scans displayed on her computer screen. "Both of you are showing high levels of connectivity in regions associated with creativity, emotional processing, and self-reflection, significantly higher than most subjects in your age group." "Is that because of the writing?" Eleanor asked, studying the vivid images with curiosity. "Possibly," Dr. Chen replied. "Or perhaps you were neurologically predisposed toward this kind of growth all along, and the circumstances of your separation and reconciliation simply provided the catalyst. Either way, you're demonstrating remarkable cognitive flexibility and emotional intelligence, which challenges many prevailing assumptions about aging brains." In October, they submitted the completed manuscript of their joint memoir, titled Useless and Used Up, Finding Each Other After 60 Years, to Jessica and the team at Meridian Press. The early feedback was enthusiastic, with the publisher proposing an accelerated timeline for publication the following spring to capitalize on the continuing momentum from the film's success. As autumn painted the Berkshires in brilliant hues of red and gold, Eleanor and Frank found themselves adapting to yet another unexpected development in their perpetually evolving lives. The documentary about their journey, completed over the summer, had been selected for broadcast on PBS as part of a special series on aging in America. Advanced screenings for critics generated significant buzz, particularly around the film's unflinching examination of gender dynamics in long-term marriages and its hopeful message about late-life reinvention. The critics are calling it revolutionary, Vivian reported during one of the writing group meetings, displaying the review on her tablet. Listen to this. Thompson and Thompson offer a masterclass in vulnerability, demonstrating how even the most calcified patterns of behavior can be transformed through courage, honesty, and a willingness to begin again, at any age. The broadcast was scheduled for November, with a special preview screening at the Retreat Center for the current participants and alumni from the first session. The event turned into an impromptu celebration of Eleanor and Frank's journey, complete with a cake decorated with an image of Eleanor's book cover and champagne toasts to their continued evolution. "You've changed lives," Marlene, one of the original participants, told Eleanor during the reception following the screening. "Not just through your writing, but through your example. Watching you reclaim yourself at 78 gave me permission to pursue my own dreams." As they mingled among the guests, retreat participants, local supporters, and friends they'd made over the past 2 years, Eleanor marveled at how thoroughly their world had expanded. Where once their social circle had been limited to a few longtime friends and family members, they now found themselves at the center of a vibrant community of writers, academics, filmmakers, and fellow late bloomers who shared their commitment to growth and creative expression. "I keep thinking about parallel lives," Eleanor confided to Frank as they stood together near the windows overlooking the retreat grounds, now carpeted with fallen leaves. "About Eleanor and Frank who might have continued in the same patterns indefinitely if you hadn't called me useless that morning, if I hadn't found the courage to leave." Frank nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "I think about that too. How easily we might have missed all this. How we might have remained trapped in roles that no longer served either of us, gradually growing more distant and resentful without ever understanding why. I wouldn't trade this, any of it, even the painful parts, for that alternative," Eleanor said softly. Frank's hand found hers, his touch both familiar and newly meaningful after all they had experienced together. "Neither would I." November brought another milestone, Frank's 80th birthday, which Eleanor insisted on celebrating with a gathering that honored not just his longevity, but his transformation. She invited a carefully curated group of people who had been instrumental in their journey: Sarah and her family, Jessica, Vivian and members of the writing group, Dr. Chen, and several of the men from Frank's cardiac rehabilitation group who had become genuine friends rather than mere acquaintances. "I want to make a toast," Eleanor said, raising her glass once everyone had been served, "to Frank, not just for reaching 80, though that's certainly an achievement worth celebrating, but for demonstrating that it's never too late to become a better version of yourself. For having the courage to examine long-held beliefs and behaviors. For supporting my growth even when it challenged your own comfort. And for finding your voice as a writer, adding an essential perspective to our shared story." The genuine affection and respect in her words brought tears to Frank's eyes, a display of emotion he would have suppressed in his former life, but now embraced as evidence of his ongoing evolution. "Thank you," he managed after a moment, addressing not just Eleanor, but the entire gathering. 2.5 years ago, I was a different man. Rigid, controlling, increasingly isolated in my own narrow perspective. I had no idea what I was about to lose, or what I would gain through that loss. He paused, gathering his thoughts. Someone recently asked if I regret the word that started all of this, if I wish I could take back calling Eleanor useless that morning. The truth is, I regret the pain I caused, but I cannot regret where that moment ultimately led us. Sometimes, a crisis is exactly what we need to break patterns that no longer serve us. December arrived with news that exceeded even their most optimistic expectations. The film adaptation of Useless had been nominated for multiple Golden Globe and Critics' Choice Awards, including Best Adapted Screenplay and Best Actress for Catherine Winter's portrayal of Eleanor. "They want us to attend the ceremonies," Eleanor told Frank after speaking with the producers. "Red carpet, designer clothes, the whole Hollywood experience." Frank laughed, shaking his head in amazement. "Can you imagine telling our younger selves that at 80 and 81 we'd be walking red carpets and giving interviews about a movie based on our lives?" The surreal quality of their situation struck them both frequently, the improbability of finding themselves, in their 9th decades, at the center of cultural conversations about marriage, gender roles, creativity, and aging. Yet there was purpose. In this unexpected visibility, a sense that their story was serving as both mirror and possibility for countless others examining their own lives and relationships. In January, they traveled to Los Angeles for the Golden Globe Awards, a journey that tested Frank's stamina, but one he insisted on making despite Eleanor's concerns about his health. "I wouldn't miss this for anything," he assured her as they settled into their first-class seats for the flight. "Besides, Dr. Chen says the stimulation and excitement are probably good for my brain. Keep those neural pathways firing." The awards ceremony itself was a surreal experience. The cameras, the celebrities, the elaborate pageantry all in stark contrast to their usual quiet evenings at home or the retreat. Yet there was something validating about sitting in the audience, surrounded by the film industry's elite, as Useless received recognition not just for Catherine Winter's performance, but for the strength of its storytelling. And the Golden Globe for Best Actress in a Drama goes to Catherine Winters for Useless, the presenter announced, triggering thunderous applause. Catherine, elegant in a midnight blue gown, made her way to the stage with graceful determination. After thanking the director and producers, she focused her attention directly on Eleanor and Frank, visible in the audience. "Most importantly, I want to thank Eleanor and Frank Thompson, whose courage in sharing their story made this film possible. Eleanor, your journey from invisibility to empowerment has inspired millions. Frank, your willingness to acknowledge your failures and commit to growth offers a powerful model of masculinity rarely depicted on screen. Your real-life transformation is the true award winner here tonight." The camera cuts to Eleanor and Frank, their faces reflecting a complex mixture of emotions: pride, humility, a touch of discomfort at the public exposure, and deep appreciation for the acknowledgement of their shared journey. February brought the publication date for their joint memoir, launched with a major marketing campaign and a book tour that would take them to 15 cities across the country. The initial reviews were overwhelmingly positive, with critics praising the book's innovative structure, emotional honesty, and nuanced exploration of gender dynamics in long-term relationships. What sets Useless and Used Up apart from other memoirs about marriage is its dual perspective, wrote the New York Times reviewer. By allowing readers to experience the same events through both Eleanor's and Frank's eyes, the Thompsons create a profound meditation on how differently we can perceive shared experiences based on gender, personal history, and societal expectations. The Washington Post was equally enthusiastic. The Thompsons have accomplished something remarkable here, a literary collaboration that serves as both powerful memoir and relationship guide. Their unflinching examination of how patterns of behavior calcify over decades and how even the longest relationships can be renewed through honest communication and willingness to change, offers hope and practical wisdom for readers of all ages. As they traveled from city to city for book signings, interviews, and speaking engagements, Eleanor and Frank found themselves continually moved by the responses their story evoked. In Seattle, a man in his 70s approached Frank with tears in his eyes. "I saw myself in your chapters," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "The way you described becoming more rigid and critical with age, withdrawing emotionally, taking your wife for granted, it was like reading about myself. I brought my wife with me today because I want to start having the conversations we've avoided for decades." In Chicago, a woman close to Eleanor's age embraced her after a reading. "I left my husband last month after 53 years, she whispered. "Your book gave me courage. I've already started writing my own story." These encounters reinforced the sense of purpose that had emerged from what began as a personal crisis. Their private pain and subsequent growth had somehow transformed into a beacon for others navigating similar terrain. A map through the complicated territory of long-term relationships, aging, and identity. In March, as crocuses pushed through the melting snow around their Connecticut home, they received an unexpected invitation from the White House. The First Lady, inspired by their story and its impact, was organizing a summit on healthy aging and wanted them to participate as keynote speakers. They're particularly interested in how creative expression can support cognitive health and emotional well-being in older adults, Jessica explained, forwarding the official invitation. "Your experience with writing, and now Dr. Chen's research on your brain activity, makes you perfect representatives for this conversation." The summit, scheduled for early May, would bring together researchers, healthcare providers, policymakers, and advocates to explore how society might better support the growing population of older Americans. Eleanor and Frank would share their story as a case study in the potential for growth, purpose, and meaningful contribution well into the 8th and 9th decades of life. "Remember when retirement meant gardening and occasional visits from the grandchildren?" Frank mused as they discussed the invitation. "Now we're advising the White House on aging policy." Eleanor smiled, recognizing the continued expansion of their influence and purpose. From invisible to indispensable. Who would have thought? In April, exactly 3 years after the morning that had changed everything, they returned to the site of their separation, the kitchen of their Connecticut home, where Frank had uttered the word useless, and Eleanor had made the life-altering decision to leave. They had decided to mark the anniversary with a private ritual of acknowledgement, a way of honoring both the pain of that moment and the extraordinary journey it had initiated. Standing in the kitchen, now remodeled to accommodate Frank's newfound interest in cooking, they held a small ceremony that Eleanor had designed. 3 years ago today, in this room, our lives changed forever, she began, holding a small candle. Words were spoken that caused deep pain, but ultimately led to profound transformation. Frank nodded, his expression solemn but peaceful. Words that revealed how far we had drifted from seeing and valuing each other. Eleanor lit the candle, its flame casting a warm glow in the morning light. This light represents the awareness that emerged from that painful moment, the clarity that allowed us to recognize patterns that no longer served us, the courage to imagine a different kind of relationship, the commitment to growth that has brought us to where we stand today. Frank took her hand, his grip firm despite the arthritis that had begun to stiffen his fingers. "And where we stand today is beyond anything I could have imagined 3 years ago. As authors, as speakers, as subjects in a scientific study, as inspirations to others facing similar crossroads. As partners in the truest sense," Eleanor added softly, "not defined by roles or obligations, but by choice and mutual respect." They stood together in silence for a moment, watching the candles flame, each reflecting on the extraordinary trajectory their lives had taken since that April morning. The pain and growth, the separations and reunions, the discoveries about themselves and each other that had transformed not just their relationship, but their understanding of what was possible in life's later chapters. Later that day, as they prepared for a small celebration dinner with Sarah and her family, Eleanor received an email that added yet another dimension to their continuing story. A producer from a major streaming service was interested in developing a documentary series based on the second chapter writer's retreat, following participants through their creative journeys while incorporating Eleanor and Frank's guidance and insights. They want to call it Second Chapters Finding Your Voice After 60, Eleanor explained as she showed Frank the proposal. It would follow a group of participants through an entire retreat session, documenting their progress, challenges, and breakthroughs. Frank reviewed the email with interest. It's a natural extension of everything we've been doing, a way to reach even more people with the message that it's never too late to reclaim your voice, to start again, to discover new aspects of yourself. As they discussed the possibility, their excitement building around this latest opportunity, to extend their influence, Eleanor was struck by how thoroughly their concept of legacy had evolved. 3 years ago, if asked about their legacy, they might have mentioned their children and grandchildren, perhaps Frank's career achievements, or Eleanor's years of service at the library. Now, their legacy encompassed so much more. The memoir that had touched hundreds of thousands of readers, the film that had brought their story to a global audience, the retreat that had helped dozens of women discover their creative voices, the research study that was challenging assumptions about aging brains, and the countless individuals who had found inspiration in their journey from crisis to transformation. "We've come so far from where we started," Eleanor mused, gazing out at the garden where spring flowers were beginning to emerge. "Sometimes I wonder if there's a limit to how much growth is possible, how many new beginnings one life can contain." Frank considered this, his expression thoughtful. Maybe that's the most important message of our story, that there are no limits, that growth and reinvention remain possible until our final breath, that it's never too late to become more fully ourselves. As the afternoon light bathed their home in a golden glow, Eleanor reflected on the word that had once wounded her so deeply, useless, and how thoroughly it had been disproven, not just by her success as an author, but by the ripple effects of that success. The women finding their voices at the retreat, the couples re-examining their relationships after reading their memoir or seeing the film, the researchers gaining new insights into creativity and aging through studying their brains, the policymakers reconsidering societal approaches to supporting older adults based on their example. From the deepest pain had emerged the most profound purpose. From a word meant to diminish had grown a legacy that continued to expand in ways they could never have imagined. "What are you thinking about?" Frank asked, noticing her contemplative expression. Eleanor turned to him, a lifetime of experience, reflected in her eyes, the pain and joy, struggle and triumph, endings and beginnings that had shaped their extraordinary journey together. "I'm thinking about how sometimes the worst moments contain the seeds of the best possibilities," she said softly, "and how grateful I am that we found the courage to plant those seeds, to nurture them, and to share the harvest with others." Frank nodded, understanding. From crisis to purpose, from wounding to healing, from useless to essential. "And the story continues," Eleanor added, her voice warm with anticipation for whatever new chapters still awaited them. Outside their window, spring unfurled in all its promise, a living metaphor for the renewal they had discovered in life's later seasons, a testament to the possibility of blooming brilliantly, unexpectedly, magnificently, no matter how many winters one has weathered. 5. Years had passed since that fateful morning when Frank had called Eleanor useless. What had begun as a painful rupture in a 60-year marriage had blossomed into an extraordinary journey neither of them could have imagined. On a bright spring morning, Eleanor sat in the garden of their Connecticut home, putting the finishing touches on her third novel. At 83, Her creative energy showed no signs of diminishing. If anything, her writing had grown richer with each book, drawing on a lifetime of observations and the wisdom gained through her remarkable late life. Transformation. Frank approached, carrying 2 cups of coffee, a daily ritual he had adopted during their reconciliation years ago. At 85, he moved more slowly now, but his eyes remained bright with engagement and purpose. "The roses are particularly beautiful this year," he observed, settling into the chair beside her. Eleanor nodded, accepting the coffee with a smile of thanks. They've finally found their perfect spot. Sometimes it takes years to discover where you truly belong. The metaphor wasn't lost on either of them. Their own journey of discovery had taken decades, requiring pain and separation before they could find their way to a more authentic connection. Their professional lives had evolved in ways that continued to surprise them. Eleanor's memoir, Useless, had remained on bestseller lists for over 2 years, eventually being translated into 27 languages. Their joint follow-up, Useless and Used Up, had become required reading in marriage counseling. Programs and university courses on gender studies and aging. The film adaptation had won 3 Academy Awards, including Best Actress for Catherine Winters, who had become a close friend and vocal advocate for their work. The second chapter, Writer's Retreat, had expanded to 3 locations across the country, with plans for an international branch in Tuscany. Hundreds of women had found their creative voices through the program, many going on to publish their own works. The documentary series following participants through their retreat experience had garnered critical acclaim and a devoted following. Perhaps, most unexpectedly, Frank's late-blooming writing career had flourished in its own right. After contributing to their joint memoir, he had discovered a talent for fiction, publishing a series of short stories exploring masculinity, aging, and redemption from a perspective rarely represented in literature. "Sarah called this morning," Frank mentioned, interrupting Eleanor's thoughts. "She wanted to confirm we're still giving the keynote at the Aging with Purpose Symposium next month." Eleanor nodded. "I've been making notes for our presentation. 5 years of perspective gives us so much more to share about the long-term impact of reinvention in later life." Their daughter had followed her parents into advocacy work around aging, leveraging her background in healthcare administration to develop programs supporting creative engagement for older adults. The family's transformation had rippled outward, touching countless lives in ways they continued to discover. "Hard to believe it's been 5 years," Frank mused, gazing at the garden they had rebuilt together, metaphorically and literally. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday that you walked out the door with that small suitcase." "And sometimes it feels like another lifetime," Eleanor replied, "as if those people were characters in a book we once read." Their reflection was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Chen, the neuroscientist who had been studying their brain activity since they began their creative collaboration years earlier. Her research had expanded into a longitudinal study tracking cognitive function in older adults engaged in creative pursuits, with Eleanor and Frank as her prime case studies. "The latest scans are remarkable," she announced without preamble, characteristically direct. 5 years of sustained creative activity has actually reversed some age-related changes in your neural pathways. Your brains look decades younger than your chronological age would suggest." Eleanor laughed. "So we're literally getting younger. Through writing?" "In some meaningful ways, yes," Dr. Chen confirmed. "The findings support our hypothesis that creative engagement, particularly when it involves emotional processing, narrative construction, and collaborative thinking, creates a neuroplastic response that counters typical aging patterns." The scientific validation of what they had experienced subjectively was gratifying, though not surprising. Both Eleanor and Frank had felt the cognitive benefits of their creative work, the mental sharpness, emotional resilience, and continued capacity for growth that defied conventional expectations about aging. Later that afternoon, they welcomed a small group of retreat alumni who had gathered to celebrate the 5th anniversary of the program. The gathering had become an annual tradition, a chance to share updates on creative projects, personal growth, and the continuing impact of finding one's voice later in life. "Before I found the retreat, I thought my story didn't matter," shared Judith, a 78-year-old whose memoir about surviving domestic violence had recently been published. "Eleanor and Frank showed me that our most painful experiences can become our most powerful contributions." As the alumni shared their stories, Eleanor was struck by the tapestry they had created together, each individual thread of transformation weaving into a larger pattern of possibility that challenged cultural narratives about aging, gender, and what constitutes a meaningful life. That evening, after their guests had departed, Eleanor and Frank sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. Their hands found each other by instinct, the gesture both familiar and still meaningful after 65 years of marriage. 65 years that had included both deep pain and profound joy, stagnation and growth, misunderstanding, and finally, genuine seeing. "What do you think the next 5 years will bring?" Frank asked, his voice contemplative. Eleanor considered the question. At 83, she was acutely aware of life's finite nature, yet paradoxically felt more expensive in her thinking than she had decades earlier. "More writing, certainly. The retreat will continue to evolve. Perhaps we'll finally take that trip to Japan we've been discussing." She paused, squeezing his hand gently. "But mostly, I hope for more of this, quiet evenings together, meaningful work. The knowledge that our story has helped others find the courage to write new chapters in their own lives." Frank nodded, understanding. "From crisis to purpose, that's been the thread running through everything, hasn't it? The painful moment that created space for something new to emerge." As darkness settled around them, Eleanor thought about the word that had once wounded her so deeply, useless, and how thoroughly it had been transformed. What had been intended as dismissal had become a catalyst. What had caused pain had ultimately led to profound purpose. "We should probably consider a title for that memoir about these past 5 years," Eleanor mused. "Jessica has been gently pushing for it." Frank smiled, his expression visible in the soft glow from the porch light. "How about essential, the continuing journey from useless to indispensable?" Eleanor laughed softly, appreciating the symmetry. "Perfect. A reminder that our stories don't end with one transformation, that becoming is a lifelong process." As they sat together in comfortable silence, the first stars appearing in the darkening sky, Eleanor felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for the success and recognition they had achieved, but for the journey itself. For the courage to leave when staying would have meant continued diminishment, for Frank's willingness to grow beyond rigid patterns, for the community they had built around shared values of authenticity, creativity, and the belief that it's never too late to become more fully yourself. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice soft in the evening quiet. Frank turned to her, understanding in his eyes. "For what, specifically?" "For changing," Eleanor replied. "For allowing me to change, for becoming someone I could return to not because I needed to, but because I wanted to." "The privilege has been mine," Frank said, his voice thick with emotion. "To witness your becoming, to find my own voice alongside yours, to discover that our ending was actually a beginning." Above them, the stars multiplied in the velvety darkness, bearing silent witness to the infinite possibilities that await those brave enough to speak their truth, to begin again, to transform pain into purpose, regardless of age or circumstance. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.